Good evening, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning. One of the great things about these online GLAS events is that it's put us back in touch with a lot of people who've left Geneva over the recent years and who are now welcome back into the GLAS community because we can do these online events. The good news is that many of you have been very generous to our chosen charity for these events, the Edith Wilkins Foundation for Street Children in Darjeeling. We've raised so far, I think, just over 9,000 euros, and we had two very generous donations which made up the bulk of that, but many of those of you who can afford to give something are making donations. I've had a letter of thanks from Edith Wilkins, the wonderful nurse from Cork who has spent most of her life working with street children in India, especially in Calcutta, and more recently now in Darjeeling. And it's a bit of sad news. We all know that during the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been a worldwide increase in domestic abuse and sexual violence, unfortunately. And Edith writes to me today to tell me that yesterday, two little sisters, aged 7 and 9, were brought to the home, the residential home in Darjeeling. Their mother had run away and their father is a day labourer. Two local lads and an older man took advantage and have sexually assaulted them. Who in the name of God can do this, says Edith. The two little darlings will be with us at the moment and the court case will be heard next week. It's a stark reminder, though, that the evil in this world doesn't stop for anything or anyone. Without the amazing support of GLAS and a few other groups, we couldn't be there for these little ones. A million thanks. All the best, Edith and the staff there in Darjeeling. So if you want to know more about the Edith Wilkins Foundation for Street Children, you can check out the website, you can check out our website, or go directly to Edith Wilkins Foundation for Street Children. So tonight we have a very, very special guest. Owen, are we online? Sorry, I think we had a technical problem there, but I think we're back online now.
No, Dennis, we're all good. Yeah, everything's working. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Owen. That's Owen O'Sullivan, our top producer there in the background. So tonight we have a very special guest. If there was a Nobel Prize for Journalism, I think our guest this evening, Patrick Cockburn, would have won it by now. His long career with the Financial Times and the London Independent has been garlanded with many awards, including the Martha Gellhorn Prize, the James Cameron Prize, and the Orwell Prize for Journalism. When he won Foreign Affairs Journalist of the Year in 2014, the judges said, Patrick Cockburn spotted the emergence of ISIS much earlier than anybody else and wrote about it with a depth of understanding that was just in a league of its own. The great Seymour Hersh, who uncovered all the lies around the bombing of Cambodia and the My Lai massacre, and more recently prisoner abuse at Abu Ghraib, said of Patrick, quite simply, the best Western journalist at work in Iraq today. He is also the author of Out of the Ashes, The Resurrection of Saddam Hussein, The Occupation, War and Resistance in Iraq, Muqtada al-Sadr, The Shia Revival and the Struggle for Iraq, The Jihadi's Return, ISIS and the New Sunni Uprising, and the Rise of Islamic State, ISIS and the New Sunni Revolution. Patrick has also written a fine memoir, The Broken Boy, recalling his childhood in Cork, Ireland, where he contracted polio. It's a beautifully written book which draws out lessons from past polio epidemics, which are very relevant in the age of COVID-19. Patrick, you're very welcome to this GLAS Hour. Do we have Patrick?
Should be with us now. There we go.
Yep.
Patrick,
can you see me now?
I'm afraid I can't, but
we're all good, Dennis. Patrick is there, you're there, yeah. Go for it.
Very good. So Patrick, if we could just start with your own upbringing in Cork. Your father, of course, was the very famous Claude Cockburn, and that must have been a great influence on your decision to become a journalist yourself.
It was, but it was probably subconscious, you know. My father was a journalist. Both my brothers became journalists. So I suppose I sort of slipped into it. I was very briefly in the lower ranks of academia. I did my first degree at Oxford, and I was writing my PhD in Queen's Belfast in the early 70s. And then I sort of slipped into journalism from there, initially in Northern Ireland, then Beirut, then a long time in the Middle East, and then around the place, Moscow, Washington, elsewhere.
Did you have a lot of encouragement from your father for your early efforts?
Not really, no. I think it was a subconscious influence. I guess my very first job was with a private eye when I was about 18, which I got entirely because of nepotism, because my father wrote a column for Private Eye and was a friend of the editor and had been guest editor. So I got a job there, my first job in journalism. And then I was in Belfast in the early 70s, and I was sort of writing a PhD, but doing a fair amount of journalism. And then I sort of gradually shifted into full-time journalism. I went to Beirut in 1975, the beginning of the Civil War, and continued there, doing the Middle East till 1984. I went to Moscow, and after that Washington, and then back. I've mostly been in the Middle East, and particularly since the 2001 9/11, I've been sort of covering what I think of as being the 9/11 wars, or the things that came after 9/11. Some of the themes, the things that happened preceded 9/11, but there's been a sort of continuity since then of Western intervention, American intervention in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere. The rise of extremist groups like ISIS. That's really been my preoccupation since 2001.
Coming back to, we'll get on to all that, of course, in the context of your new book. But coming back to your childhood in Cork, it seems to have been a very happy childhood, at least before the polio.
Yeah, it was pretty idyllic. I mean, we lived outside. My mother comes from Youghal in East Cork, and she and my father had moved back there in 1947. I was born there, and it was sort of a fairly typical Anglo-Irish situation that, you know, we had a large, rather dilapidated country house. We didn't have much money, but we lived pretty excuse me, but we lived pretty well. You know, we didn't have a car. The telephone had disappeared in some financial emergency. On the other hand, we lived, you know, pretty luxuriously, but more in a sort of 19th century sense than a 20th century sense. You know, I got used to the idea that one just traveled around on horses, you know. By the end of the 50s, that would have been a memory. At the beginning of the 50s in Youghal, the nearby town, you know, about 80% of the transport in the main street would have been horse-drawn. By the end of the 50s, about 80% would have been vehicles.
I think you say that being Anglo-Irish, you have difficulty knowing where you're actually from. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not really. I mean, I'm very happy with being Anglo-Irish, because I think one gets sort of the best of both, you know. Yeah. The key thing, as I think somebody once said to me, you know, is not to explain what Anglo-Irish means, which means, you know, basically a sort of Protestant ascendancy, or people who'd been there, but often have been there about 800 years. So somebody said to me, for once, you know, if you go around the world explaining what the Anglo-Irish means in terms of Irish history, people will think you're an even more peculiar type of Englishman than they thought you were in the first place. So just don't mention it. I've taken that to heart ever since.
Do you have any family still in Youghal?
No, we still got a house just nearby. My parents moved in the 70s, but not very far, about 6 miles from across the Blackwater River to the village Ardmore. It's a village in West Waterford, but it's the same neighborhood. So my brother and I have the family house there.
So, Patrick, you've recently been writing again about the polio epidemic that struck Cork in the 1950s. An excellent piece in the last issue of the London Review of Books. So, Can you tell us your experience of that?
Yeah,
What you recall of
this
it?
was in 1956. I was age 6. Um, there was an epidemic had started in Cork at the beginning of July. We were in London, um, and my parents came back, which seems a rather peculiar thing to do in the middle of an epidemic. But they thought that we were isolated in the countryside and that, we wouldn't catch it. Actually, we weren't completely isolated. As my father was going backwards and forwards between London and Cork, doing freelance journalism. And also, they didn't realize something which is sort of true of the COVID-19 virus as well, that almost everybody got the polio virus, but only 1 or 2% of people actually had ill effects from it. So people at the time were sort of mystified that somebody in the middle of the countryside, of people who are healthy and so forth, would suddenly get it. The reason is that the polio virus was flourished in modern cities, in the modern parts of modern cities, because previously people who, before you had good clean water supplies and sewage disposal and so forth, people would get self-immunized at an early age. But when you had better health conditions, that didn't happen anymore. You were suddenly vulnerable. So the people who got it were actually the better off. And this wasn't just true of Cork, it was true of New York, and there was a big, and Melbourne, Copenhagen, Chicago. It was modern cities, and the better off part of them that were hit by the virus. And it was also known as infantile paralysis. So it created real terror. I think actually even more terror than COVID-19, because people would suddenly, their children would fall sick and they'd be crippled for life. A certain number of people died, but an awful lot were badly crippled. So they were sort of walking advertisements for what could happen to you if you got polio. The most famous of them, of course, was FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Yeah.
He got it surprisingly late, when he was 39, and was very badly crippled. Actually, even worse than he looked, because he would have himself sort of propped up as if he could stand up, but he couldn't sort of walk. Otherwise, he was in a wheelchair.
It doesn't seem to have stopped you from having a very distinguished career.
Yeah, I was okay. I mean, I wasn't okay. My legs, I mean, my legs were disabled, but I was just on the right side of being able to move about and so forth. It wasn't like that for everybody. It came as it was also a sort of big shock. A 6-year-old, I've been living, this rather sort of idyllic life in the midst of the Irish countryside, with horses and donkeys and everything else, and having a great time. And then I remember I'd gone into Youghal to see a cousin of mine, and she wasn't there. And but her mother noticed that I was sort of looking a bit feverish and so forth. And of course, everybody was on the alert for polio, so she drove me home. And then the fever got worse, and the doctor came the following morning. And I can sort of remember flashes of it. I can remember his sort of stethoscope on my chest and so forth, and everybody being concerned. I think initially I rather liked the idea of everybody sort of paying attention to me, but then I was put in an ambulance, and then I got really terrified. And my mother said, "Oh, the ambulance will sound its siren," sort of thing that people say to cheer up children, and it's usually ineffectual. And then I knew something very bad was happening. So then I was taken to the fever hospital in Cork, St Finbarr's, and they kind of knew in Ireland at that time that there were recurrent waves of polio epidemics. They'd concentrate their resources in the fever hospitals, and this was one of them, the best nurses and the best doctors. And I was there for about 3 weeks, and they'd come, the doctors would come in the morning, and they'd feel my leg, ask me to raise my legs. They'd sort of say, shake hands. Of course, they really wanted to see if my fingers were still working, and asked me to sit up. And I didn't really sort of know what was happening to me. I was isolated from my parents, sometimes I'd look up and see there was a sort of door with a sort of porthole in it, glass, and I'd see my parents sort of frantically waving from the other side of it. So I was isolated there. My brother arrived, he'd also got it. He'd gone to school. The headmaster didn't want anybody to know that he'd got it, so he didn't send him to the hospital, he'd sent him home. And after that, I went to another hospital in Cork called Grunawrahar. It was a former place which had been designed as a TB hospital, but in fact, all the children were coming there who'd been crippled by polio. Actually, it was a horrible place because all the best nurses and doctors were in the fever hospitals or had gone to England. At that time, a lot of the nurses and English. I was in an English hospital in Whitechapel later, and half the nurses were Irish, who were very good, but the ones in this place in second place in Cork were really pretty terrible. So at that point, my parents decided I was sort of dying because I wasn't eating or anything. So eventually they just took me out of there, took me home, and then very gradually I began to improve physically.
And it was only, I believe, when you were in Baghdad that you began to reflect more on the experience from the point of view of investigating what exactly happened. Is that correct?
That's right. I mean, I didn't sort of, it's not that I wasn't conscious of it, because I was very conscious of being disabled over the years, but I didn't sort of really go into what happened to me. I think because I felt that, you know, what had happened, and thinking about it wasn't going to do me a lot of good, which was true. And I had a lot of sort of emotional scar tissue from this sort of very traumatic event. And then I was in Baghdad going around the hospitals. This was during sanctions, economic sanctions there. And the hospitals were very, they lacked equipment and of the most basic kind and so forth. And then I thought, hold on a minute, I used to be in a hospital and I know more about these guys than I know about what happened to me. I didn't even know what year the epidemic had happened. I couldn't have told you if it was a virus or a bacteria. So I thought I'll find out about this. I read a few books about polio and then came back. And then I found that you find quite a lot of victims of polio are still alive, because we all got it when we were small children. I was 6, and there were people who were smaller than I was, who were still around, but the doctors and nurses were all dying off. And not many people had actually written about this, or practically nobody. I was a bit surprised about that because, it paralyzed Cork for a year, and there was a real terror, excuse me, greater terror than people feel for COVID-19, I think. But then when the vaccine had actually been invented before I got it in the early 50s it's called the Salk vaccine. But they were only testing it and beginning to use it in America. It hadn't been used in Europe. So in a way, I was sort of unlucky to be just on the wrong side of the vaccine coming in. And so I started, I interviewed doctors and nurses, and I found it very interesting. But the city itself, when you ask anybody, say, oh yeah, my uncle had it and so forth, but it was never written down.
Do you think that had something to do with the lack of media coverage of it at the time, due to commercial pressures from business interests in Cork?
They were pretty careful to limit the publicity that it got. It was pretty weird. At that time, there was a paper called the Cork Examiner, which was the sort of the Bible of everybody in Cork. Nothing happened in Cork that wasn't reported in it, and this was pre-television. And my father told me that about halfway through the epidemic, the people who owned the big shops and the businesses in Cork had gone to the family who owned the paper and said to them, look, we're going out of business because of the epidemic. So stop reporting it. Initially, the paper had reported it, but very carefully. They would say 6 cases discovered, and then underneath there'd be a subheadline saying doctors say no cause for panic. Of course, if there was one thing that makes people panic, is telling them not to panic. They know something is very wrong.
Yeah.
I was interested here when the epidemic started in the UK to find British ministers saying, "Do not go panic buying in the supermarkets." I'd been to the supermarkets a couple of days before. There was no panic buying. As soon as they said this, people were jumping in their cars, thinking, "My God, if there's panic buying, I better go and get the stuff before it disappears." So it was so anyway. There was all this stuff in the papers telling people not to panic, and I never was quite sure about my father's story. It seemed to, but when I looked at the files of the newspaper, of the Cork Examiner, I found halfway through, I think about the sort of middle of September, and I was admitted to hospital 2 weeks later. They just stopped reporting it. There's no more reference to it, which was sort of pretty amazing.
Do you see any parallels between the media coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic and the, of course, much lesser incidence of the polio epidemic in Cork, but the reaction of the Cork Examiner, is it reflected in any of the reactions you're seeing in the media today to how COVID-19 has been covered? I mean, commercial interests seem to loom large in how politicians are responding to COVID-19. No?
It is, yeah. I mean, they certainly in Britain, they have a problem that there was all this frightening stuff at the beginning to encourage people to lock down, saying everybody can get it and so forth. And then now they're trying to sort of de-frighten people to get them to go back to work. But of course, you can't do that. Fear isn't something that has a sort of reverse gear on it, and you can suddenly say, well, that's all a bit exaggerated. Also, because there's quite a lot to be frightened of, and also maybe because trust in the government isn't that great after various sort of missteps about care homes and so forth. So in the Cork epidemic, the doctors said, look, this is unstoppable, and it will burn itself out. That's rather what the British were going to do, or what the Swedes seem to be doing. People themselves, I think there's a natural instinct to, when you have an epidemic disease, to run away from it, which is not entirely stupid. People themselves were sort of quarantining themselves, they were demanding that the city be cut off from the rest of the country. Other cities in Ireland were demanding that people from Cork should be not allowed to leave the city. The doctor said, look, this is impossible. And also, of every one person who is displaying symptoms, there are 100 or 200 who aren't displaying symptoms who are spreading it. So it's not feasible. But there was a strong sort of public instinct to shut the place down, to quarantine, and also they couldn't quite believe that it didn't come. They sort of thought of it as being a bit like cholera, that it came from dirt. They wanted the drains cleaned, everything else done. Actually, this was never going to do any good. But I think that the government was there were a lot of things they didn't think would do much good, but they tried to do just to reassure people. So, there's lots of talking now about tracing and tracking in Britain. But, I talked to, when I got it, there was a farm next to our house. And the farmer who'd been there told me that the day after I got it, that there was somebody from the Ministry of Health had come and said, look, there's polio next door. Patrick has got it. Take your children out of school and don't leave the farm. And although that wouldn't necessarily stop people getting it, it did a lot to reassure people that they were sort of at least trying to keep people away from known polio cases.
That's, I suppose, what we would call today a non-pharmaceutical intervention. We have a question here for you, Patrick, from Ida Milne, who's actually writing a history of the flu pandemic. She's asking, what do you feel is the longer term impact on your view of your own health, apart from the actual physical damage? Are you more aware of health issues than you might otherwise have been, do you think?
To a degree, it made me think quite a lot about epidemics and how they worked. But even when I wrote a book called The Broken Boy about it, which just about what had happened to me. At that stage, I read that in about 2006. At that stage, I thought the era of epidemics was probably over, that I'd been a bit unlucky to be caught by polio. But, you know, the diseases that used to be present in epidemic form, you know, like smallpox and cholera and TB and so forth, a lot of these were disappearing or had disappeared. And it didn't really occur to me that just like modernity had opened the door to polio, polio had probably always been around, but it hadn't been in epidemic form, or nobody had noticed it, that actually another virus could also be the fruit of modernity, like COVID-19. I thought that's the sort of the end of the grand epidemics, which perhaps was naive of me, but I think many people felt the same.
So, Patrick, moving on to your forthcoming book, War in the Age of Trump, perhaps a good way to start would be if you could read us a little something to set it up from the preface.
Let me do that. I'm going to turn on a light so I actually see the thing, so I may look a bit ghostly. Let me just read you the preface, if I may, but it just tells you what the book is about. This book covers the critical 3 years after the election of Donald Trump as US president in November 2016. This coincided almost exactly with the start of the 9-month siege of Mosul by the Iraqi army, which was to be the decisive battle in the defeat of Islamic State. The terminal date for the book is the fall of 2019, when Trump announced the on-off US military withdrawal from Syria and opened the door to a Turkish invasion of northern Syria. At the same time, mass street protests broke out in Iraq and Lebanon and were beginning to shake the political dominance of Iran and its allies in the Shia heartlands. Much of that during that period concerned the rise and fall of the de facto Kurdish states in Iraq and Syria, and the final elimination of the self-declared Islamic State Caliphate, culminating in the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And I went through the event. The volume, I handle things in 2 ways, which is what I reported at the time, and so to get, and also the reflections on what this meant, which I wrote subsequently. And both have their advantages. It's important to know what events looked like when they were still happening, but also to see in retrospect how things panned out and what was their true significance. You know, as historians have often said, it's important to remember that the past was once in the future. I tried to give a voice also to what Syrians and Iraqis and Kurds felt about events as they unfolded around them. Their instincts, honed by decades of danger to themselves and their families, were often sharper, or at least different from mine. I always try to keep this in mind. Keep in mind the warning of an Iraqi friend who told me as we drove through a particularly violent district north of Baghdad to, quote, "Take off your seatbelt. No Iraqi ever wears one, and it identifies you as a foreigner." It made an impression on me at the time that
sure it did.
Just wearing a seatbelt was a rather dangerous thing to do in Iraq, because people would immediately see that there's something strange about this guy.
A cultural marker. How do you think the arrival of Trump on the world stage has influenced this theater of war that you've been covering for so long?
It's been very strange. Trump hasn't actually, despite all the belligerent bombast, has not actually started any wars, and he hasn't started a war in the Middle East, although he's come pretty close, you know, and it may still happen. At the same time, he is a force for instability, particularly in Iraq. That's the sort of arena, the likely arena for confrontation between Iran and the US. We saw this beginning of the year with the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani by a US drone at Baghdad airport. The Iraqis are very worried about that at the moment. The other thing about I think about Trump is, you have Trump's policy, and then you have a large chunk of the sort of American establishment, the Pentagon, who often want to pursue a different policy. So you have this extra instability in a place like Syria that Trump announced he's going to withdraw troops from northeast Syria. You may remember at the end of towards the end of last year. But then there's pressure back from different sort of powerful forces in the US, and suddenly US troops are going back into northeast Syria. So you had a sort of kind of stable balancing act there with, the Turks and the Syrian army and the Kurds and the Americans, everybody else in northeast Syria. And somehow a couple of months later, you had the same thing, but it's actually more unstable after Trump's intervention. So you have Trump, and on top of that, you have the fact that the policy that emerges is often a compromise between contending factions in the US, and that makes things even more unstable and dangerous, to my mind.
Well, why do you think Trump authorized the assassination of Soleimani? I mean, as you say in the book, I think never interrupt an enemy when he's in the middle of making a mistake, and the Iranians were making lots of mistakes until that moment.
Yeah, I think it's probably true of politics in general. It's certainly true of the Middle East, and particularly of Iraq, that, whoever is ahead in the game there tends to overplay their hand. The way Iraqi politics works, to my mind, is you have lots of centers of power. The biggest ones are obviously the Kurds and the Sunni and the Shia. But then Iraqis have a saying, that there are four powers in Baghdad. You have the government, you have the Marjia, which is the Shia religious hierarchy. You have the tribes, and you have the Hashid, which is the paramilitary militia. People say, if you have a traffic accident, it's not if you're right, it's what tribe you belong to. You have all these contending factions. And it's very difficult for any faction or outside backer to win a complete victory. Now, the Americans after 2003, were very arrogant, thought they'd won. Things fell apart in their hands. The Iranians, the last few years, have been doing the same thing. And you could see this. Soleimani was sort of, very visible there. And particularly what happened was at the end of last September, I was in Baghdad at this time, 1st of October, there were these protests going on, and demanding food, jobs, and end of corruption, and better supply of electricity and water and so forth. They weren't actually at that moment getting anywhere, but somehow the Iranians thought that maybe the Americans were behind it or something. So they sort of bare factions within the security forces and within the paramilitaries just opened up on these basically very peaceful protesters. And that the whole sort of protest took off from that. So Soleimani was probably behind that. I think he was overplaying his hand. It was taken as a big blow to Iran when he was killed. And in some ways it was, I suppose. But the real blow to Iran, to my mind, was, that they'd managed, this was the protests were by the Shia, the people who'd been 2/3 of the Iraqi population who'd been supportive of Iran and supported by Iran. Suddenly, the Iranian-backed factions were shooting the Shia. You had 600 or 700 dead. You had 15,000 to 20,000 wounded. Suddenly Iranian consulates are being, burned out in different cities. It was an amazingly stupid policy that Soleimani had introduced. So actually, I think his departure didn't necessarily have the kind of negative effect for Iran that many people assumed.
Patrick, could I just ask you to turn off your reading lamp? I think it's
sure. Yeah, sorry.
Only
giving me a ghostly appearance, is it?
Ghostly and ghastly.
I'm sorry about that.
No, it's fine. Patrick, What do you think is the original sin, if I might use the phrase, in the Middle East that has caused this, ongoing series of cataclysmic events? What do you date the origin of it to? Or is it possible to do that?
Well, particularly in the territory between Iran, south of Turkey, that sort of northern tier, right over to the Mediterranean, where you've got, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. They all have different religious and ethnic communities. What really tends to make things explode there is when you get dissident local communities plug into a foreign backer, and then the two come together and you have explosive consequences. You have money and weapons coming into the country. Often the foreign backer gets entangled in local politics in the way the Americans did in 2003.
Well, can you trace that back to the colonial influence in the region?
Sure, yeah. I mean, Iraq was always a frontier zone under the Ottoman Empire. Then the British came in, and it really basically had a pretty disastrous time there. I mean, a couple of years after they'd taken it over, there was an uprising. The French in Syria, also pretty disastrous. But, the whole colonial history of the place tends to exacerbate things.
Were you optimistic when the Arab Spring got underway?
I wasn't really, but a lot of what people were telling me was that I'd heard the same sort of thing in Baghdad in 2003. Saddam will go, and everything will be great, because he caused all these religious differences and all these other differences. I always thought that was baloney. And I thought when the Arab Spring came, people saying in Libya, we get rid of Gaddafi and everything will be okay. Then you looked at the guys who are going to replace Gaddafi. They obviously couldn't replace Gaddafi, and you should be, a lot of these things, it's what I found so peculiar about writing about the Middle East. It should have been obvious to everybody, to governments, that if Gaddafi goes, there will be murderous anarchy. This isn't a vote for Gaddafi. It's just the alternative isn't there. If Saddam goes, he's a Sunni Arab, then the Shia majority will feel their day has come. There's going to be a social revolution in Iraq. They didn't seem to sort of take that on board at all. I always thought they could get rid of Saddam, and if they got out immediately and handed over to the UN or something, you still would have had a tremendous disruption, but you wouldn't have what happened. The Iraqis were never going to accept occupation by a foreign power. And this should have been pretty obvious from the beginning.
So you would argue that the status quo should have continued?
Well, it's perfectly reasonable. I knew the Iraqi opposition then. They knew very well that they knew from 91 that there'd been a great Shia and Kurdish uprisings against Saddam. Those had been crushed very bloodily. Saddam was he was a thug, but he was an intelligent thug, was going to crush any attempt at a sort of coup d'etat in Baghdad by the generals. The only alternative was to bring in a foreign power. The only foreign power you could get to do it was the Americans. And then the Americans sort of jumped into it. There was a big conference just before in London, just before this happened, with all the Iraqi opposition and some of the big American diplomats. And I remember an Iraqi friend of mine saying to me, who very much wanted to get rid of Saddam and have the Americans do it. He said, I just hope the Americans don't realize before this happened that what they're about to do is not in their interests. It always amazes me how great powers with intelligence services and foreign, lots of diplomats and so forth, manage to make these very sort of simple and disastrous mistakes from their point of view.
You're often credited with being one of the first Western observers to spot the rise of ISIS. What was it that alerted you to that phenomenon?
Well, I laugh because it should not have been difficult to spot this. Yeah. In 2013, Daesh had captured Fallujah, which is a Sunni city about half an hour's drive from central Baghdad. The Iraqi army couldn't get them out, or didn't try very hard, but it certainly failed to get them out. If you have, you know, a foreign a force like ISIS, which is just down the road from Baghdad, holding a city, and the army can't get them out, you can see how the balance of power has changed. So it should have been fairly obvious what was going to happen. It's also, you know, the Iraqi army had, you know, at that time was deeply corrupt, and you know, all the jobs, if you're a general or a colonel, you could buy. You had lots of ghost battalions, you know, that were paid for by the state, but there weren't any soldiers or supplies. The money would all go to the officers. Iraqis, a lot of Iraqis I know had said, look, their army isn't going to fight. You know, it's anything that happens, it'll dissolve. That's exactly what happened. And so a lot of this was should have been pretty obvious.
Why did so many flock to the banner of ISIS?
Well, first of all, you have the deep division between Sunni and Shia in Iraq, and indeed across that strata, the Middle East. Secondly, the war in Syria had opened up a great sort of power vacuum in eastern Syria, and ISIS filled that because they had, you know, experienced, trained fighters, money, weapons, etc. They could sort of take advantage of the vacuum in Syria.
But where were these fighters coming from? Were they from the old Iraqi army? Were they jihadis?
Some would. You'd have guys who, you know, from 2003 would have been fighting the. They would have been fighting the Americans, fighting the Iraqi army, and some of them would have got pretty good at it. You know, that there's a sort of Darwinian thing with armies, that guys who sort of survive are often the best at doing it.
But who was the organizing genius behind it?
I don't think there really was one. You know,
No?
You had Mosul in the north. This was where the Iraqi officer corps essentially came from. Under Saddam, the defense minister always came from Mosul, this city about 2 million in northern Iraq. A lot of these guys were unemployed, so there was quite a lot of military expertise there. And then you had guys who'd been sort of fighting and, you know, gained by experience, and they got pretty good at it, and they remained good up to the end. I mean,
how important was religious zeal? Was that genuine? Or
oh yeah, no, it was genuine. You know,
Yeah,
it sort of they'd give people ideological training. You know, I mean, it was a sort of monstrous ideology. And when they won their victories, they captured Mosul, they felt they were divinely inspired. God was on their side, and they had a sort of about 100 days in 2014. We know where they came sweeping south towards Baghdad. I was in Baghdad at that time, and there wasn't a lot between them and us. Then they turned, and they were sweeping through eastern Syria as well. Then they turned and attacked the Kurds. Quite why, not entirely clear. That brought in the Americans and other foreign powers. So politically, they weren't very astute, but militarily, they were pretty good at it initially. But you know, ISIS, they saw all the world as their enemy, and all the world became as their enemy. So they just sort of eventually their enemies were sort of more numerous than them.
how big a blow was it when al-Baghdadi was killed?
I don't think it was that big. It was symbolic. You know, the fact he was up in northwest Syria, hiding out there, that they'd basically been defeated in all the old caliphate. You know, at its height, the caliphate stretched from just short of the Iranian border to almost to the Mediterranean, and from sort of just west of Baghdad right up to you know, the border with Turkey and so forth. It was an area about the size of Great Britain. It was pretty big. So, you know, they were a pretty extraordinary phenomenon. And these guys would fight to the finish. You could see that in Raqqa, and you could see that in Mosul.
Talking about Raqqa, would you like to read a passage to us from the book?
Yeah, it's sort of, we're going to have to turn this light on again. So
no problem.
It's
the occupation of Raqqa went on for what, 2 years almost?
That's longer. They took it in about 2013, and they held it. I think it was 2017. They lost it. It's it's always been it's on the sort of Euphrates, just Euphrates River, an Arab city. They let me read a short passage. It's this is part of a chapter in the book, which is about how ISIS tried to defend the city, and one of the ways they did this, because the other side had air power and heavy artillery, they dug this extraordinary system of enormous tunnels under Raqqa. Shortly before the siege of Raqqa began in June, Islamic State officials arrested Hamad al-Sajja for skipping afternoon prayers. Hamad, who is 20, made a living from his motorcycle. He carried people and packages, charging less than local taxis. IS had arrested him a number of times before, mostly for smoking cigarettes, which were banned under ISIS rule. But he had always been released after paying a fine or being lashed. Attendance at prayers was compulsory, and he had missed the Asr, the afternoon prayers, because a passenger had made him wait while he went into his house to get some money for his fare after a trip to Raqqa's old city. Except it turned out not to be prison. On his first morning, militants blindfolded us and took us in a vehicle to a place that seemed to be inside the city, because it took no more than 10 minutes to get there. Hamad and the other prisoners, all of them local men, were taken to an empty house. In one of the rooms, there was a hole in the floor. Rough steps led down about 60 feet before the tunnel flattened out into a corridor, which was connected to a labyrinth of other tunnels. A fellow prisoner, Adnan told Hamad that IS had started work on what was effectively a subterranean network a year and a half earlier. In other words, construction began in 2015 after IS's spectacular victories. It goes on as a description of this sort of great tunnel network which they built, which it didn't, at the end of the day, it didn't save them, but they fought very hard. Almost all of Raqqa is destroyed. I've been there since. The thing is that in Mosul and elsewhere, although because most of the US Air Force, there were other European Air Forces there as well, although they said they could hit things with pinpoint accuracy, they didn't actually know where the other side was. So they ended up by hitting everything. So almost everything got destroyed. And very heavy civilian casualties. I suppose they could certainly argue, what else could they do? That in that area, if the other side has air superiority, what IS would do, you would have a building, with civilians in it, let's say 5 floors. They'd take out the civilians on the 3rd floor and put their fighters there, but you'd have civilians above and below. So you ended up having these massive civilian casualties.
Patrick, could you knock off that light again, please? What do you think the chances are of ISIS coming back, or have they ever gone away?
They haven't gone away, but I don't think they'll come back in the same way. It makes a good headline, ISIS coming back. The first time around, they came by surprise. I was saying people shouldn't have been surprised, but they were surprised. They won't have surprise anymore. Secondly, they depend on the Sunni community, which suffered, appallingly from the defeat of ISIS. And they don't feel as sort of divinely inspired as they once were. they suffered a massive defeat. And the Iraqi army, the other armies there, they're much better than they were. There isn't a vacuum for them to fill. That isn't to say that they can't do a lot of damage. And, we were talking about polio or COVID-19 before. They don't have to do much to create enormous terror. In a way, they're a bit like a pandemic that way. I was in Baghdad some time ago, there was an attack on some policemen on a road north of Baghdad. Some of them were killed and so forth. But immediately all my Iraqi friends were saying, oh, it's back again, it's going to happen again, my God, Because people were so terrified the previous time that, they're very susceptible to fear from ISIS. But I don't think it's quite justified by events. I mean, many other bad things are going to happen there and have happened. But I don't think that that's necessarily going to be one of them. But it doesn't mean that also, they aren't a factor.
Is there any one event or one episode over the last years that stands out in your mind for its horror or its indication that things were spiraling out of control?
Iraq in 2005, 4 to 6 was pretty bad. The sectarian warfare of people just being dragged out of their cars and murdered if they were Sunni or Shia or Kurd for that matter. That was pretty bad.
And has that stopped now?
Yeah, I know that stopped quite a long time ago. Sectarian tensions are still there, but they're not as they were. ISIS was pretty bad. They were monstrous. Enslaved the Yazidis. They murdered people. They're still finding mass graves in what used to be the Islamic State. So all these things were pretty bad. At the moment, Iraq has just got a new government. I know a lot of these people, they're pretty good people. And one of the problems about the whole Middle East is, the price of oil is down. Iraq is an oil state. You get a tomato in the market in Baghdad, it probably comes from Iran. If you buy a pair of socks in the same market, it probably comes from Turkey, so they don't, if a lot of these places just are completely dependent on oil, particularly Iraq.
Is there any optimism at all for the future, you see?
It might turn out better. It's sort of, it depends a bit what happens with the US, with Trump. But you have these sort of Trump-inspired crises, and they're always on the sort of verge of a war breaking out. A war could have broken out last year. It didn't quite, but it got fairly close. You also have the people around Trump, often with very little idea what the real situation is on the ground, and full of bombast and so forth. So, once it's a very remains a very unstable situation, and it might go either way.
We have a question here, Patrick, from Porrig Rooney, who says, Nick Davies in his Flat Earth News held a mirror up to the state of journalism some 10 years ago. Do you think journalism in the age of Trump is in a healthy state?
Not really, no. It's one of the things that I've found over the last, decades, is that there's more and more sort of need for good journalism in the Middle East, but there's less around. This is partly the internet. You have the big internet platforms take most of the money, the advertising money. So and a lot of the big papers, particularly in the US, like the Baltimore Sun and Chicago Tribune, Boston Globe, that used to have big bureaus all over the place, don't have them anymore. I was Financial Times correspondent in Moscow. That Time magazine had a big I've got a big office, much bigger office. A lot of these people just aren't there. So you have a sort of deprofessionalization of journalism. And it isn't made up by sort of so-called citizen journalists. Usually they're working for some faction on the ground, and it isn't really made up by freelancers. In a place like Baghdad, it's can't a freelancer can't go there and just stay in a hotel. They'd last about 2 days. Stay in a private house. So, they'd last about 2 days. They have to stay in a hotel, in a fairly protected hotel. That's a bit less true than it was, but it's still true. So you see less professional journalistic institutions there and less professional journalists around. That said, there are still good people around, and you can still find out what's happening. But overall, journalism has got weaker than it was, say, 40 years ago.
Do you think the Middle East conflict is much less well covered than, say, Vietnam was? And
it probably is now. It's more difficult to cover. It's more difficult to cover because Vietnam was a single country you could get into and out of. The Middle East is, in areas that where ISIS, or let's say northwest Syria, where the anti-Assad forces are, journalists, very few journalists can go there because it's too dangerous, because you'll get kidnapped and or shot or whatever. I think the volume of government propaganda has got greater and is more professional than it used to be. And you need, propaganda is always part of war or conflict. Each side puts out their version, and they've got pretty good at it, and that's been a sort of feature of journalism in the Middle East.
Weapons of mass destruction comes to mind.
Well, there's that, but before that, I don't know if you recall in 1990, after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and a young lady got up in front of the US Congress and brought to the US Congress saying she'd been a nurse in a hospital there, and she'd seen Iraqi soldiers tipping babies out of their cots onto the floor and leaving them to die and so forth. This had a very big impact at the time, except she turned out to be the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador in Washington. So far as I know, she'd never been near the place where this had happened. The problem is when these stories are made up, you kind of they have a bad smell to them, but it's very difficult to refute them, chapter and verse.
If there's nobody there on the ground to check it out, yeah.
And also, it's difficult to do. Same thing happened in Libya. I remember, there was a story that went around that a woman said that she'd conducted a survey among Libyan women, and a lot of them had been systematically raped by Libyan troops and so forth. This again got great play everywhere. And eventually it was Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the UN, each set up sort of people to investigate this. They all eventually concluded that there was absolutely no evidence for this, except by the time their reports appeared, and they take quite a long time to put together, everybody lost interest. The story had moved on. So, it's difficult to combat those things. And in a way, governments have gotten better organized to put out that sort of story. And one's always going to be fighting propaganda to a degree, but I think that the ability of journalists to do it has certainly gone down during my career.
Patrick, to close, I believe you have a final passage for us from, fittingly enough, from the Graveyards of Baghdad.
Yeah, it's sort of, I'm not sure how it's going to, it's just, I've always been fascinated by the cemeteries in Baghdad, because, Iraq is a place of sort of forgotten wars. The British fought the Turks there in the First World War. And I don't think many British realize that, that the British and Indian Army lost 40,000 dead and 60,000 wounded there. There are 100,000 casualties. I used to visit these sort of rather pathetic cemeteries, and I found that they sort of put me in, they gave me a sort of a sense of history there. And there's also a curious thing. It tells one a little bit of how Iraq is like. Apart from witches who come here to bury spells, few people visit the British Northgate cemetery in Baghdad. The witches believe that words written on paper and placed in the ground between the graves of non-Muslims, particularly old graves, have enhanced magical powers. Northgate in the Wazaria district is a large quadrilateral of burnt grass, fringed by palm trees. There are 511 graves with tombstones, almost all of them dating from the calamitous British campaign in 1914-18, with 40,620 soldiers from the British and Indian armies killed in fighting the Ottoman Turks. British military cemeteries looked after by the Commonwealth Graves Commission are dotted around Iraq, looking for somebody to let me into this into the Northgate this summer. I asked a group of women standing outside their houses by the cemeteries if they shared the superstition common in Iraq that it was unlucky to live near such a place. They said they didn't mind the cemetery, but didn't like the witches who climb, quote, the witches who climb over the fences in the middle of the night so they can carry on their work among the dead. One of them said that wherever she saw witches, she would phone the cemetery caretaker, Syed Jassim, and he would come and scare them and drive them away. It's a curious thing. I was just interested in Iraqis often believe in sorcery. It's partly that life can be so difficult there that you're sort of desperate for somebody to help you, and you find people will pay good money for spells to get jobs, to get a contract. A bureaucrat doesn't sign off on something. You want to have a decent spell on him. I remember in Abu Ghraib, which used to be with Saddam's famous prison there, a lot of time people wouldn't buy houses there because they said all the houses were inhabited by ghosts of people who died in the prison. One guy actually brought a legal action against somebody who sold him a house there, saying he hadn't told him the house was full of ghosts. And so, it's a very sort of bizarre place. But I used to go, the sort of other cemeteries up and down Iraq, and in Kut, the British were besieged there, suffered a terrible defeat. One has to sort of keep these sort of things in mind in Iraq and not be consumed by the present situation. Now, and it's a funny thing that sort of countries don't really sort of seem to learn from their previous disasters in Iraq. When the British came in 2003, I don't think half of them ever knew that there'd been a British army there before.
Yeah,
they might have thought about that one.
Yeah, we keep repeating our mistakes. No, it's a sad fact of life.
Well, I think when people feel they're winning, they think that it goes to their heads invariably, particularly in the Middle East. I've seen sort of the Americans come into the Israelis come into Lebanon, and they all met disaster, and similarly in Iraq and similarly in Syria.
Well, Patrick, it's been wonderful talking to you for the last hour. We've and to hear your insights into the situation there. A very complex subject to try and cover in an hour, but we're very much looking forward to your book in July. And I, for one, will be placing my order for it from Verso Books. And I do hope that in the future, when we get back to having our live events, we'll be able to welcome you in person to a GLAS event here in Geneva.
No, I'd love to. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Good night, everybody. Talk to you next week. Bye. And thank you to Owen O'Sullivan for producing tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.